when we zoom out from not just like the pharmaceutical industry that might be making these compounded versions of the drugs, but now onto the patients who might be taking it, that's like a pretty significant impact. There are some estimates putting it into the millions.
Welcome back to Healthcare Strategies. I'm your host, Olivia Kaler, Senior Editor of Pharma Life Sciences, and today I'm joined by Executive Editor Sarah Heath to talk through what the FDA's latest move to end the GLP-1 shortage officially means for patients who've been using compounded versions of these drugs. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm not a scientist or anything, but I do have some insights about what this could all mean for the patient. So I'm excited to chat, and I'm excited to learn a little bit more from you, Olivia, because I know that you have a lot more expertise in some of the science and the policy making that is behind a lot of this.
Well, and that's why I have you here. I'm actually really excited to hear what you have to say on behalf of the patients, because this change is definitely going to be something that impacts a lot of people. They may not realize it, unfortunately.
For sure.
So let's just go ahead and start with the shortage and how it's ending. Currently, GLP-1 receptor agonists, they depend on two APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, if you will. Those are semaglutide and tirzepatide. The FDA recently took these off the national drug shortage list. And so that officially ends like the temporary permissions that allowed compounding pharmacies and outsourcing facilities to make the different versions of these drugs. So let's just break down the dates for that. So semaglutide, since they're different, for semaglutide, small compounding pharmacies, so we're talking like your 503As, they had to stop making it by April 22nd. But for larger outsourcing facilities, those are more like your 503Bs, they have until May 22nd. So right now, you're pretty much only able to access, if you're a patient, semaglutide through these compounding facilities, because for tirzepatide, the deadlines were much earlier, February 18th and March 19th, respectively. This means compounding facilities can't legally or sell compounded versions of these drugs unless it's approved by the FDA. So really that means the only compounding facilities that are able to make compounded versions of this drug after May 22nd are your 503As, because those are your smaller facilities. Those are going to be your smaller individualized doses. So those are literally the only ones that can do it. 503Bs, they can no longer after those dates that I just mentioned.
Yeah, and I think this is notable because a lot of patients actually went the compounding route to get a GLP-1 because they couldn't get the name brand version of the drug for numerous different reasons. Either their insurance didn't allow for it, they might not have been able to afford it regardless of insurance coverage. So with the compounding options going away, patients are going to be pushed back to having to go through that more like traditional healthcare process of getting their provider to write the prescription, their insurance to cover it. There are numerous hurdles involved, prior authorizations, insurance delays, all of those things that we in the industry are super familiar with. And ultimately, this kind of creates like a real concern about whether the system can handle this influx of patients who are trying to access the branded versions of the drugs. So yeah, the shortage isn't necessarily being caused by a lack of active ingredients, but just a lack of injector pens. And I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely, Sarah. And I want to make note for everybody in our audience that the shortage is not due to a lack of our active ingredients, right? It's not due to a shortage of semaglutide or tirzepatide. It's actually a lack of the injector pens that the active ingredients are actually in. So it's kind of surprising because in other countries, the injector pens are not part of these drugs. They actually get vials and the dosing's different. So if America was not operating on this injector pen, I'm not sure if this shortage would have ever been reached.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So it's not the active ingredients that are expensive. So that's not the limiting reagent. And I just want everyone to be aware of that. These drugs, they're not expensive. How we are administering them, those devices are expensive and they take longer to create.
That makes a lot of sense. And I didn't know that in such clear statements. I'm sure I've read it and been like, yeah, but hearing you like just clearly state it that way makes a lot of sense. I don't know if we should move into talking a little bit more about what even a compounded GLP-1 is. I'd love to tap into your expertise on that.
Yeah, definitely. So compounded GLPs, these are versions of the popular diabetes or weight loss drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy. Those are your semaglutides. Those are manufactured by Novo Nordisk. And then we have Mounjaro and Zepbound. That's your tirzepatide. That's produced by Eli Lilly. And those versions are being made by compounding pharmacies. Well, right now only semaglutide is. But those are basically customized formulations that aren't FDA approved, but were allowed during the shortage. So when the FDA declared that we were in a national shortage, these 503As and 503B pharmacies, which I'll get into later exactly what these mean, they were able to then produce these drugs to meet the need. But now that the shortage is ending, they are no longer able to create these drugs.
Can you talk about the different types of compounding pharmacies? I know that there are specific ones, but I'd love to hear what makes them distinct.
Yeah. So like I said, there's two types, 503A, 503B. 503As, I like to think of those as like, I like to remember it like this. 503A, they're more abundant. There's more of them, but they're smaller. Okay. So these are the pharmacies that are actually going to make like custom tailored medications for specific patients based on prescriptions. So say you have a child who is allergic to some inactive ingredient within their antibiotic, right? So you would have a compounding facility then remove that inactive ingredient for that patient so that they are able to take it. Or if there's a certain type of drug that is only in a tablet form, but someone's unable to swallow a pill, then you could have it made into an injectable version. So those are more personalized changes based on your own personal health information. The 503Bs, those are going to be like your larger facilities. So both of these pharmacies, they do follow rules, but specifically 503As follow more of like the state rules, whereas 503B is more federal. So like you could think of it like 503As are like more personal, 503Bs are like small factories. They are able to meet more demand, greater demand. And so with those bigger batches, with those 503Bs, and that's actually, I just now thought of that, bigger batches, 503B, bigger batches without prescriptions. And they sell those to primarily healthcare facilities, and then they can meet the manufacturing demands through that. So for this specific talk, most of these GLP-1s are being manufactured through 503Bs. So that's the pharmacy that's losing the ability to create the compounded, that's why it's such a big deal.
Yeah. And I think when we zoom out from not just like the pharmaceutical industry that might be making these compounded versions of the drugs, but now onto the patients who might be taking it, that's like a pretty significant impact. There are some estimates putting it into the millions of patients who've taken compounded versions of this drug. KFF has done a lot of surveying about GLP-1s and where patients are getting it. And it's not just the doctor or the specialist writing a prescription, but it's people getting them online, where a lot of those online pharmacies were touting those compounded versions. They're getting them from med spas. Some of them are getting them from unspecified sources. So these are folks who are really getting these more customized or not customized, who are getting these compounded versions of the medications. Now, in terms of what type of patient is accessing these compounded versions of the medications, I don't have a ton of great data about who's accessing it, but I do have some data about who is not accessing the reference drug, which kind of gives you an inverse picture, right? Okay. So the folks who aren't accessing the reference drug, which is the expensive version of the medicine, those are your Black patients, your Asian patients, your Hispanic patients, and your low-income patients. So those are the people who, if they're going to get a GLP-1, they're a lot more likely to get that compounded version. So this is giving us a lot of insights into who's going to be affected by these changes. And ultimately, we need to think about how patients are learning about these changes, because these are the people who are taking the medicine, right? And will be putting it or not taking the medicine, as we might get to later in our conversation.
Right. And honestly, I'd be curious to know just how many patients the patients that are taking these compounded versions, do they realize that they are going away or have gone away, right? So that's the scary part, in my opinion, because then where are they turning to? Like you said, med spas. Well, something that we have to consider with compounding drugs, like, yes, we primarily relied on overseas for Chinese APIs because let's be honest, they don't really recognize our patents the way we do here. So they're going to be getting a product overseas. Sure, it could be from a manufacturing facility that is FDA registered, but how do we know that? Right? Yep.
And I think what makes this conversation even scarier is that we don't know what we don't know. So if we're talking about, you raised the question of how many patients know that this change is coming, I don't know. We don't have, I hope maybe there are some large think tanks that might be surveying public awareness of these changes, but it's only a few months into the ending of the shortages. So I don't think that we quite have our hands on that data yet, but we're really hoping that there is enough public messaging so that patients are aware, oh, I was taking a compounded version.
Yeah.
There aren't those FDA registered facilities making those anymore because they're not allowed to. So anything else that I could get compounded isn't safe. That's the ideal.
Okay.
Do I think that's happening? I can't say for sure. And I am sadly a little bit pessimistic. There could be a lack of communication between prescribers or pharmacies to patients. It's also just kind of a difficult concept to explain. I mean, we've spent 15 minutes talking about what a compound is and the different types of pharmacies and all these regulations. So that's a lot for your typical person to be able to absorb.
It's extremely nuanced, right?
Right. Yeah. And especially health literacy is pretty low in this country. So being able to wrap our heads around what these medications are, that's like a pretty tall order for patients. So it's definitely going to necessitate providers to have these open relationships with patients, to know what they've been taking so that they can further advise them so that they can be really safe with what they're putting into their bodies. And I also think that this creates a big risk in interrupting medication. The patient can't just refill a compounded version that no longer is allowed to be made. So while we've been talking a little bit about like counterfeit product, there's also just like this question of the patient's no longer taking it and what happens then. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of risk about how much patients know about this situation and how much guidance they're getting about how to move forward from here.
Yeah, I just feel like it's putting patients in a position where they can easily find a product that they should not be putting inside their body, like you said. And I think we should talk about maybe what happens next for these patients, right? Let's say they were on compounded versions and now they have to switch, whether they were on these products for diabetes or weight loss. They're gonna have to switch to FDA branded, FDA approved, and brands like Wegovy, Zepbound for weight loss, Ozempic and Mounjaro for managing diabetes. But like you said, it's not as simple as just picking up a prescription. And I think the biggest glaring issue here is cost or lack of insurance. But I also think something to consider here too is I think a lot of people bypassed their insurance to even go for these compounded versions. I'm not sure if all of these patients asked their insurance companies, hey, here's my A1C, do I qualify? Before they went for a cheaper version. Because I know some of these people are paying out of pocket for compounded versions. They're paying out of pocket anywhere from $400 to $600 per month. Well, insurance coverage could get you something like $100 or less coverage per month. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that anyone who's considering these drugs, whether it be for diabetes or weight loss, they should check with their insurance companies to see if it's covered or if something similar, whether it be Eli Lilly's version or Novo Nordisk's version, is covered under their policy. If not, then I think that's when you need to explore alternate avenues. But again, these avenues are disappearing.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you bring up. Like, how many people like raised their hand and said, I have a medical issue. Doctor puts in for the prescription for Govi or Zepbound or Ozempic or Mounjaro, and then it got denied, and that's what led them to the compound? Or
Sure.
How many people were like, I'm on a weight loss journey. I want a GLP-1. I'm going to Google, where can I get a GLP-1? And then they got it.
And I understand wanting that now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Without the prior auth, without going to the doctor to get the approval. I understand that 100%.
Yep. Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially, first off, just like the personal desire to do that, but then also is there necessarily an understanding that some of these medicines are prescription medicine? Who knows? So that might have also been like part of what prompted, I'm just going to go online and get this.
Right. And that may be derived from patients not understanding how you qualify for these drugs, whether it be for diabetes or weight loss.
Right.
And then I'm sure you just have discouraged patients who wouldn't qualify otherwise, but they don't see any other avenue to losing that weight. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think something that I guess we haven't really talked a whole lot about, and I'm not sure if it really is a problem, but like for diabetes, if your insurance is covering it, then this losing the compounded versions really isn't a problem for you because you do get coverage and it is less expensive. So that's why this conversation is, I guess, a little more toward the weight loss, obesity crowd, because they're the ones that are paying more out of pocket.
Yeah, because I know Medicare isn't covering it for weight loss and obesity. So whether commercial or employer-sponsored insurance is covering it for those indications is very murky as well. But so that's definitely like an added layer to it. And I also think this gets back to some conversations that I had with healthcare providers a while ago, just frankly, we were talking about care management strategies for patients who are on these medications. But they were talking about how the concept of weight loss in America has been so commercialized. And it's this moral failing that it is the individual's responsibility to fix. And so you go out and you purchase this medicine that's going to be the fix, as opposed to a holistic, whole patient-centered view of how to support weight loss, which, to be very clear, medical intervention is an arm of that approach. But I don't know. I think it just gets to the idea of going out and purchasing the medicine that is the fix. And I think as we have people who are running into some of these like very common roadblocks, including the prior auths, the insurance denials, we're going to have a lot of patients who are suddenly helpless and needing to have a provider or someone in the healthcare system who's able to help them be like, actually, here's like kind of the more ideal road to accomplishing this goal that you have.
Absolutely. And I will add, I know it sucks to see these compounded versions go because we're losing a lot of access, right, for our patients. But I think a lot of patients who maybe have been turning to or solely have been using these compounded versions will be pleasantly surprised if they do end up on a patented version. There are multiple stories out there of physicians saying they have a patient coming in, they're on a 1 milliliter injection and they transfer it to the 1 milliliter of the patent product and they have crazy results after. Well, lo and behold, the original compounded version wasn't FDA approved, so therefore we can't confirm what the dosage was. But I think we can confirm based on the results that it was probably lower than the patented product, right?
Yeah.
So I know it's unfortunate to hear that a lot of these medications are going to be unavailable, but switching over to the patented products actually may give you better results, especially for weight loss. So it's not so sad, I guess, in a way.
Yeah. And I wonder, and neither one of us might have an answer to this, but I wonder if as we are switched over to the patented products and we see people who are able to achieve more optimal results because they're on the FDA approved patented product, how that will strengthen the evidence base such that insurers might be able to justify the ROI of covering these drugs for weight loss. I'm not sure, but that's what struck me when you were talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think just to hit it all home, like I know I have talked to people across the industry that say that compounded GLP-1s, they serve a purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Especially during shortages. We saw that here. Mm-hmm. But they're never meant to be a long-term sustainable solution, especially to the obesity epidemic that our nation's facing, right? Mm-hmm. It's estimated that over half of U.S. adults might qualify for a GLP-1. Yeah. That's outstanding. That's 130 million, close to 130 million people. But then again, if you think of that in a compounding concept or scenario, we can't expect our compounding facilities and outsourcing facilities to pick up the slack for 130 million people. That's crazy. Because then we're taking away from those individuals, those children who are allergic to certain inactive ingredients in their antibiotics. So it's a catch-22, right? Like we need these compounding pharmacies, but only in certain circumstances. And they're definitely not a solution for these GLP-1s. Mm-hmm. And we've heard it over and over and over from many industry experts.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you said compounding has its place, but I was filling in the end of that sentence with, but not at scale. Yeah. Like it's not necessarily a solution at scale. I do think that it's important to start thinking about some of the more long-term solutions to this GLP-1 problem. Because like you mentioned, over half of US adults might qualify for a GLP-1, which indicates a pretty massive chronic illness problem in the US. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about policy solutions around affordability and not just around supply.
Yeah, and I think that all comes back down to how we operate patents here in the US, unfortunately, and market exclusivity, right? Mm-hmm. GLP-1s are still under very tight patent protection. We only have 2 companies, and only one of those companies are based in America. Mm-hmm. So that means no generics, no biosimilars, no real competition of any kind to bring down the price, right? And then on top of that, these companies are using patents to effectively block the competitors from entering the market for decades. And that does nothing for the patients. So, take for example Ozempic's active ingredient, semaglutide. Their drug maker, Novo Nordisk, there was a report that was put out. And according to that report, they had applied for over 300 patents on this one active ingredient in the US alone. They were granted 154 of them. The main compound's patents are now extended from originally 2026 now to 2031. And then they added 49 more patents for small changes, like delivery devices, different dosages. The company has stretched their market exclusivity to 2042.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So we're looking at no competitors until then. That's not okay for access at all.
Yeah.
So I think that the only way to tackle the pricing is to tackle the extensive patent web that all of these large corporations have managed to capitalize on.
Yeah, and I think obviously we can all recognize the way in which exclusivity might reward innovation, but it's also keeping prices to kind of like a miracle drug. I mean, there are so many other ways that GLP-1s are improving health outcomes beyond diabetes and weight loss, but just limiting it even to those two, the way that it can improve outcomes for patients with some of the most expensive chronic illnesses. And yet we see that demand balloons at the same time that cost balloons due to some of this market exclusivity is really, really difficult to watch sometimes.
It's discouraging. I can only understand being a patient, right? It's discouraging for me, and I'm not a patient of these. I don't take these drugs.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine.
Yeah, I think until we have more of a market with generics and biosimilars, we're going to continue to see these challenges, which, as you said, is super discouraging, just knowing the positive impact that these medicines can have on people's lives.
Absolutely.
I don't know if we should transition into talking a little bit about the oral GLP-1 drug. I know you reported a little bit on it and I was able to do the copy edit on it, but I'll let you take it because you're the expert.
Yeah, well, I guess I am happy to end this episode on a more optimistic note. Although this is all speculative, we don't really know at this point. But at the beginning of this month of May, Novo Nordisk's oral version of semaglutide was accepted for review by the FDA. So if that's approved, that'll be the very first oral GLP-1 for chronic weight management that is like on par with the injections, which is huge, right?
Yeah.
So we don't know the pricing yet, but I mean, we're looking at like a 25 milligram oral tablet for obesity, but that could come with some real advantages. There's no refrigeration needed, which is the injectables do need. Easier to travel with. You can take it with you much easier than having to pack a cooler with your injections and stuff like that. And no needles. Anyone who is afraid of needles, I think they're cheering for this, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, we don't have an estimate on price, and we don't know when this is going to be approved by the FDA, but I can imagine that this is going to be a game changer.
Yeah, I think so much about medication adherence, which is like part of the overall debate about GLP-1s, mostly in terms of people being able to continue to pay for it. But beyond cost, barriers to medication adherence include whether the patient can tolerate taking the medicine. And that is a huge question for people who would have to be stuck with a needle regularly. It's not fun. I'm not in the position, but I can't imagine that it's fun to do. And I'm sure it's a lot easier in terms of the patient knowing how to take the med.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of everyone knows how to, well, I don't want to say everyone knows how to swallow a pill because that's also hard. As someone who coughed up her vitamin C earlier today, swallowing pills is hard. But there's no training necessarily involved. Whereas with the injectable, you do need to make sure that you're following that correctly. But as you said, pricing remains kind of a question, which will always influence access, as will payer coverage. So like you said, speculative, but hopefully promising.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, the main reason the shortage happened was due to the device. So with the pill, the device is not even part of the equation, right?
Yeah.
So I can only imagine how much easier it'll be to get that medication in the mouths, if you will, of those who need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we have to wrap this up. I could talk about this all day long, Sarah, but thank you so much for walking me through this today. Yeah. And thank you for highlighting what this all means for the patient's perspective. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I feel like I learned something. So I'm so glad that we were able to connect on this. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you, listener, for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple and drop us a review. We will be choosing some of our reviews to be read on the show in appreciation, so keep listening through to the end because you might get name dropped. See you next time. Music by Kyle Murphy and production by me, Kelsey Waddell.
This is an Informa Tech Target production.